Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to sit down for this talk. I don't know if some of you have seen I'm on crutches at the minute, so I'm going to take this one sitting down. So hopefully you can all see and hear me okay. So yeah, as Chloe introduced today, I'm going to be talking about Terraform's transition from its open source Mozilla public license into the business source license, and the most well-known fork resulting from it, OpenTofu. So last year, HashiCorp introduced the business source license for Terraform, and as Kat put it in her keynote, it was a bit messy. I saw all the blog post titles like, "Is this the death of Terraform?" I remember my project manager at the time, very well-meaning, but he saw the post on LinkedIn, and he rang me in a bit of panic, saying, "Eve, we need to drop everything. We need to switch to a different tool." And I had to say, we don't have the time for this. So that got me very into the whole story and into the whole saga, and I've been following along closely for the past year and a month now. So hopefully I can shed a little bit of light on the situation for you today. But before we jump into it, a little bit about me, my background. So my name's Eve Brennan. I've been working in the Belfast tech industry for 6 years now, and I've spent the last 3, 4 years focusing in cloud and DevOps roles, mostly involving AWS. So very excited to be at the first ever Belfast AWS Community Day, and Terraform I've been working with for as long as I've been working with AWS. So I've used it. I use it nearly every working day of my career. So this is a change that directly impacts me. Outside of AWS, I am also a co-organizer for DevOps Belfast, which is a monthly meetup for DevOps enthusiasts from Belfast and beyond. We actually have our next meetup on 17th of September, so if you're in town, all the details are on meetup.com, and please feel free to come along. We would love to have you. So I'm conscious that maybe not everyone is all that familiar with Terraform, but for those unfamiliar, Terraform is an infrastructure as code tool owned by HashiCorp. And last time I did a talk on this, there were some very strong advocates for CloudFormation in the group. So actually, Terraform was inspired by CloudFormation. Its founder and namesake, Michi Hashimoto, was very impressed by CloudFormation. However, he did see some room for growth in supporting other providers, because it's very rare that organizations will just lean on AWS. There's so many other tools that we will rely on in our operations setup. And so Terraform, it launched in 2014. No direct relation, but happened to be the same year as Kubernetes. Terraform initially supported AWS and DigitalOcean, but today it has over 3,000 providers. It was far from an overnight success. Its creators actually considered shutting it down within its first year. But in 2017, it really started to take off. And today, Terraform is recognized as one of the leading infrastructure as code solutions. There are over 1 billion downloads of its AWS provider every year, and an ecosystem of third-party tooling has sprung up around it. These include the likes of Spacelift, Atlantis, and Terragrunt to provide functionality such as state lifecycle management and testing. And HashiCorp, the organization behind Terraform, they went to their initial public offering in 2021, and the company was valued at a whopping $14 billion. Not long after, its namesake Michi Hashimoto, having already stepped down as CEO in 2016, and he decided to leave its board to return to being a full-time engineer. And he actually left HashiCorp altogether at the end of last year, which I will come back to later on. So, in line with Michi Hashimoto's philosophy of open source first software, Terraform was launched under the Mozilla public license, a permissive open source license that allows for the usage and modification. This all changed on August 10th, 2023, when in a blog post, Terraform made a surprise announcement, and that was from Terraform version 1.6 onwards, the business source license would apply. This announcement meant a departure from open source, as BSL, while it isn't a traditional proprietary software license, it does have prohibitions that aren't compatible with open source. It can be seen as a halfway house. because whilst the code is still openly accessible, there are some prohibitions, and typically these exclusions apply to production use or to cloud vendors charging for hosted access to the software. Every licensor will define their own restrictions, and for those organizations and products that do conflict, they must obtain a commercial license from the licensor. So up on the board, we have some of the restrictions that apply to Terraform. Organizations that HashiCorp deem as a competitor are no longer allowed to embed or host community edition Terraform code. That is the Go line that makes up Terraform core. Now, those companies that do that will have to pay for commercial licensing. In a nutshell, those companies that are profiting from products that they provide that incorporate Terraform's source code now have to pay up. For us as Terraform users, most of our organizations probably aren't competing with HashiCorp, nor are we embedding their code. So how does this all affect us then? Well, most of us are using third-party tooling. For example, at the time of the announcement, I was using Gruntworks TerraTest, and although this is an open source tool, they do have a paid support model, which means that they are considered to be a competitor, and therefore they would have to reach a commercial use agreement with HashiCorp to continue using Terraform Community Edition. So they opted not to do that. On the other hand, the tool that isn't impacted is Atlantis, as it's not deemed to be a competitor because it is a fully open source tool and it doesn't have a managed solution. It's fair to say most Terraform users weren't that impressed. The change sent shockwaves throughout the open source community. Every developer forum was flooded with questions, and HashiCorp very quickly had to release a FAQ section on their website. And there was very little warning, which, it was just very sudden. And people began to claim in those same developer forums that HashiCorp never really bought into the open source model because they controlled the roadmap and even would put pauses on reviewing community code submissions, which isn't really in line with what open source software should be. Given how much of our organizations rely on Terraform, this poor PR with HashiCorp was concerning. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for a fork of Terraform to be announced. In fact, it only took 6 days. Within 6 days, OpenTF was announced, and it was spearheaded by Spacework, Gruntwork, and M0 and Scalar, who were all affected by the introduction of BSL, and they feared that the transition would prevent the development of their products. OpenTF was very quickly renamed to OpenTofu over fear of trademark litigation. So, launch of OpenTofu. OpenTofu is a fork of the last Mozilla public license version of Terraform, with formal pledges of support from over 140 organizations, 600 individuals, and a commitment of 18 full-time engineers. Over the next 5 years, all eyes were on OpenTofu last August. Under the guardianship of the Linux Foundation, which is home to Jenkins, Kubernetes, Backstage, and so many DevOps household names, OpenTofu seeks to be an open source version of Terraform that can be relied on. OpenTofu claims to have the same user experience as Terraform. We can still use the same providers and modules, meaning that in theory, there should be relatively little code changes for existing projects. And to demonstrate that, I have a quick recording of a project I put together. Right. So this, as you can see in VS Code, is a very, very simple Terraform project. I've taken the official Terraform AWS modules, and I'm trying to provision an S3 bucket. So I've actually already applied this configuration, so it's in my state, just a local state. And this module comes from the official HashiCorp registry. And if you can see in the commands, I'm simply installing OpenTofu, just using brew install as this is on Mac OS. And very quickly using the tofu command. Straight away, I can check the version. Very simple to install, and all the same commands apply. So you're just switching out the keyword Terraform for tofu. It feels very, very familiar. And OpenTofu do recommend that you transition to version 1.7 before you upgrade to their most recent version. So I would highly recommend reading their migration guide if you intend to do this on anything important. This project is simple Terraform version 1.5.5, so that's the last version before it jumped into the BSL license. So what I'm going to do in my Terraform in a minute is I'm going to change out one of the tags to my S3 bucket. This will trigger a change in my Terraform plan, my tofu plan. And as you can see, it works the same as expected. And I can continue to use the FFT command and go ahead and plan and change changes. So I haven't had to change app provider or the module that I'm using, which is nice. And you might have seen in the news this week that OpenTofu have actually released their own registry. So that means there is now both the HashiCorp registry and the OpenTofu registry. However, all HashiCorp items in the HashiCorp registry are compatible with OpenTofu. Now, does this OpenTofu implementation still work with all of the tools that we lean on? So some of my favorites are TF-Lint, Chekhov, and Terraform docs, all the things you might run before you open a PR. And for the most part, yes, they do, especially because most of these are just examining the actual HashiCorp config language. So change to OpenTofu isn't too big of a deal unless you start to use the tofu specific blocks and syntax that we've started to see in more recent releases. And also I saw that OpenTofu now have an extension in Visual Studio Code. So if you're developing regularly with OpenTofu, you will probably get a lot of benefit out of that for newer versions. So this little example is very painless, but obviously very vanilla too. It's probably going to be more difficult if you have your backend up in an S3 bucket and you're maybe relying on different sources and using different modules. And especially if you've gone past that Terraform version 1.5.5, you are more likely to run into some errors with the compatibility that you will need to work through. When I made this recording, there was no way to make any overrides for Terraform specific blocks. However, there is a new file extension that OpenTofu have introduced, which is a .tofu. And what it will do is override any similarly named .tf files. So you can see, for example, I have my main.tf. If I want to add in main.tofu, it would overwrite all of the changes in main.tf. It would just ignore the main.tf file. So the drawback to this is that some of the aforementioned tools might not be compatible with the .tofu files. So proceed with caution and make sure you do your research before you jump into any of this. So that brings us on to the next topic nicely, which is roadmap divergence. Once OpenTofu reached general availability, meaning its first stable release in January with the release of 1.6, we do start to see some divergence in the roadmap. And we've seen new features pop up in OpenTofu that Terraform doesn't offer, and vice versa. The most notable one in OpenTofu is state encryption. And this is pretty exciting because previously, if you included a secret in your Terraform, even if it's marked as sensitive, it is shown as plain text in your state file. And this isn't suitable in a high security environment. This was a very highly requested feature for a very long time. However, it never materialized. And some people might say that was because HashiCorp were considering their commercial interests for tools such as their premium Terraform offerings, such as Terraform Cloud, which is now known as HCP Terraform. OpenTofu, however, it cites its upcoming features for community requested features, and this is seen to be more in line with traditional open source software. Other features that are quite interesting in OpenTofu include loopable import blocks, which is really good and really helpful if you are importing existing infrastructure into your OpenTofu state. Another really cool thing that I'm quite excited to try is early variable evaluation, which means that you'll be able to use these variables in your locals and your backend blocks where normally you're not able to use variables in Terraform. However, there are still loads of cool features coming out in Terraform. Definitely don't write it off. I do really want to try the cross-object referencing for input variable validations. A good example of that one is if, let's say, you want to define a variable, which is your AMI ID, you can now reference in your validation for that variable a data block that gets a list of all the existing legitimate AMI IDs. So you're not waiting to see whether or not your apply succeeds. It makes it easier to catch errors a lot earlier on in your plan and in your validation. So one of the features that I didn't mention was the removed block that was released in version 1.7 of OpenTofu. This was something that we already saw in version 1.6 of Terraform, which was the first BSL release of Terraform. HashiCorp claimed that this change that we see on the board constitutes copyright infringement. And in April, OpenTofu received a cease and desist letter. In this letter, we learned that HashiCorp have sent DMCA takedown orders to GitHub for certain files in the OpenTofu project. OpenTofu, however, they claim that this is an unsubstantiated claim and that the code originates from the pre-fork Mozilla public license code, and the Terraform retrospectively added BSL licensing to these files. There hasn't been any update on this as such recently, so it seems as though it has gone nowhere, but it does highlight the sort of murky boundaries that can exist when it comes to software licensing. Perhaps this was resolved privately behind closed doors, but it does reflect the tension between the two tools. And anyway, HashiCorp's lawyers are probably a bit more preoccupied with their acquisition by IBM. Only a few weeks later, after the saga of the removed block, HashiCorp was acquired by IBM. This was following persistent rumors of a sale, and some spectators suggested that the cease and desist letter was a bid by HashiCorp to appear dominant over OpenTofu to potential buyers. Whilst the utility of Terraform cannot be questioned, but transforming that into revenue and growth isn't simple. And there was a marked reduction in the growth of paying HashiCorp customers after BSL was introduced. And whilst this may be correlation and not causation given the economic environment, it does suggest that confidence in HashiCorp was diminished by the move. How IBM integrate HashiCorp offerings into their business will be key for the future of Terraform. Some commentators have even speculated that given IBM's acquisition of Red Hat, who have successfully transitioned Ansible into an open source model, perhaps they will consider changing the Terraform license to MPL. Now, this is all purely speculation, but if that were to occur, it leads us to wonder, would OpenTofu reconcile with Terraform? In the OpenTF manifesto, it was pretty clear that unless it was under the Linux Foundation, that would be unlikely. The other direction that IBM may take is to use HashiCorp to bolster the IBM cloud adoption, perhaps integrating it more closely with Ansible to create a powerful infrastructure and configuration management combo. This is still a developing story, and with the acquisition not set to complete until the end of this year, it may be some time until we see any change in direction for Terraform. So, we've talked about the history of Terraform, the impact of the BSL, the rise of OpenTofu, and the roadmap divergence between the two. It brings us to the question, what does the future hold for these two tools? When I last gave this talk in May, I said I'd be a bit reluctant to put my workloads on OpenTofu due to factors such as the DMCA takedown order, limited compatibility with Atlantis, and uncertainty about the uptake and therefore support of the project. I do feel more confident in it now that the DMCA takedown order wasn't acted upon. We're seeing some uptake quietly in big tech of OpenTofu, and Atlantis have released some guidance on how to run it with OpenTofu. If I was using tools like Spacelift or M0, that decision would have been a much more easy yes, as they are directly impacted by BSL. My worry with OpenTofu, however, is that it could eventually run out of steam. Although the signatories of the OpenTF manifesto promised 18 full-time engineers, if you look at the contributor graph on GitHub, you can see that very clearly there are only a few people regularly committing code. And whilst commits aren't necessarily the best indicator of progress, it does give you an idea that perhaps there isn't as much development going on as one might expect. At the same time, if I was the purse holder for my organization, I would be wary of HashiCorp or later IBM springing any new pricing structure changes upon us, especially as we still don't know the outcome of the IBM acquisition. Perhaps once that all settles, the landscape will change again. With some uncertainty in both tools, some other IAC, more recent ones, might seem more attractive for anyone who is starting from scratch. But for those of us who have hundreds, if not thousands, of resources defined in Terraform or OpenTofu, it is very likely that we will be looking to move elsewhere anytime soon. So for now, it's a case of weighing up what's right for your organization, doing some proof of concepts, and weighing up the facts. So thank you for having me, and I hope I was able to shed a bit of light on the situation. Thank you.
Thank you.